He had his gun, so he just swung it open.
I start to notice that, the atmosphere feels a little bit weird.
First thing he seen was this 6.5 foot tall, broad shoulder, dark hair. That freaked him out.
We hadn't talked to her about like life and death and what any of that means. She's 3 years old,
So we turned around. Suddenly there's a whole tree falling across the road.
And she was describing to us that, there was a deceased person that she could see visually.
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, where we tackle the ever-expanding history and mystery of monsters and supernatural madness every Monday. You can find us at CryptidClues.ca for more information, or even check out exclusive content and support us at patreon.com/CryptidClues.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of Cryptid Clues. I am your host, Taylor, and today we're keeping it very simple. I've got a few encounter tales to share with you all, so without further delay, let's get into it. And I quote, I'm from the Pacific Northwest area, and my dad and I used to love watching Bigfoot videos. We went to the Mount Hood area and went on this very isolated road in the middle of the woods. It's kind of by Ape Canyon, and to mess around and be funny, my dad and I made Bigfoot calls out into the woods as we were pretty high up looking down onto miles and miles of forest. It was about 5 seconds later that there was a callback. Of course, at the time, my mom, sister, and I immediately are like, oh my God, oh my God. My dad decided to make another call, and it was completely silent back. We, of course, just immediately disregarded it at the time as another human, probably out of fear, but the sound definitely came from inside the forest. And if it was a human, I feel like it would have gone back and forth. I think whatever it was realized that we were possibly human, but I guess we'll just never really know. End quote. What I like about this is the scarcity of a report where you make vocalizations and then you are met with a response. I'm no expert, but I suspect that this is Bigfoot researcher out in the woods step one. You're trying to instigate a response by replicating a call or attempting to make that call yourself. Now, I won't dismiss this technique by any means because, again, I'm not out there in the field myself, and I do think it holds a certain level of credibility. However, I say credibility loosely because we're talking about Bigfoot here. But maybe it's more appropriate to say, theoretically, attempting this to instigate a response. And theoretically, maybe it's like using a Ouija board. Eventually, after trying to call out, something will inevitably answer. It's one of those things that you need to be careful. But continuing on the line of vocalizations, and I quote, towards the end of the summer, a friend of mine convinced me to go out for a late-night ride, just to go stargazing in a local national forest without all the light pollution. Weirdly, my intuition was against this, just throwing that out there. Long story short, we shut his loud souped-up Civic off and got out onto the dirt utility road and started shooting the breeze, looking at the super clear night. Now, after about 2 minutes of this, we started talking about UFOs, spiritually staring up. And then 20 to 30 feet behind us, we heard a very loud whoop. I felt the sound on my back and my hair stood up. It sounded like it was in the middle of the road right behind us, like a low to high pitch. Looking back, it sounded like it was just a curious animal, but because it was apparently invisible and strangely loud, instincts kicked in. And we both kind of looked at each other and fumbled to get in the car and drove out of there. I'll never forget it. End quote. Ontological shock. That's a word that I would apply here, albeit not on a severe level, but a level nonetheless. Now, what that means is an individual who experiences disorientation and anxiety when their deeply held beliefs about reality are challenged or overturned. This is often leading to a questioning of their place in the universe. Sort of like a crisis of meaning and understanding when our worldview is disrupted. The result is usually negative and can warrant unexpected and dangerous outcomes, which is human nature. But it's also human nature to challenge and seek answers. It's not all bad, but it's a convoluted, conflicted internal struggle. But anyways, I digress. I think it's a very interesting scenario and experience. And again, you have that person that's with you to reaffirm and reinforce what you either have heard or what you have seen. In this case, they heard something that they did not recognize, and we've got plenty of these types of back forest roads all around, and I've gone out to go and observe the stars without all the light pollution from the city, and it is really, really nice. Of course, our roads, like most of them, are pretty frequently traveled. Lots of teenagers zipping around and going up and having fires out in the woods and drinking and partying and whatnot. So I don't think there's a highly increased chance of seeing something on some of the dirt roads that are closer to the city. If you want to go way out there, there are some logging roads that take you way beyond these boundaries, and that's probably where you would find some things. Of course, I haven't been out to those ones in a very long time. I usually stick around to the city. But anyways, I'm rambling. We're going to move on to our next encounter, and this one takes us a bit closer to home. Albeit a few decades back in the late 1970s, this one is close to the foothills of Alberta. And I quote, "It was close to Medicine Hat. I was tired, so I parked my boogie van about 2 a.m. at the side of the highway. Now, it was around 4 a.m. There was a loud bang on the side of my vehicle. This startled both of us, me and my girlfriend, but when I looked out the back window, running across the road was a tall, long-haired animal on 2 legs. I jumped up. I remember saying, 'We have to leave now,' trying to just maintain some calm so as to not scare my girlfriend. For the longest time, I blocked it out. I didn't think much about it. I find it funny that your mind won't allow you to believe what you're seeing. I think it looked back at me, but I cannot seem to remember, and I never told my girlfriend what I saw." End quote. Now, this touches back on ontological shock, but also calls back to a very common occurrence with Sasquatch reports, mostly in buildings, but the context is the same. These things have a tendency, it seems, to want to smack the side of a house or a vehicle. Why? Who knows? I don't have that answer. But if I were to add my own 2 cents of a deduction, I'd say it's maybe trying to instigate a response to see, okay, is anyone inside of this vehicle or inside of this house? They're just very curious, and apparently it got the response that it needed, and it got the heck out of that area. But moving on, and I quote, "They say seeing is believing. And I never believed these supernatural things or things like Bigfoots and Yetis until a few months ago. Leading up to the encounter, you could say, I heard really strange noises like people screaming or something like a wolf howling, as well as knocking sounds, sort of like wood smacking together, and then my dog, who I sleep with, would perk his head up and stick his snout under the blinds to look. Occasionally, he would growl, but I'd look out and not see anything, tell him to shut up, and I'd nod off to sleep because I'd always play it off as just some animal or kids messing around in the woods. Now, one night, I was watching YouTube near the middle of the night, and I heard the sound again, and of course, my dog went under the blinds and started growling, which was relatively normal, until he started barking and growling. Knowing he normally wouldn't do this, I put my hand on my shotgun that stays near my bed, wondering if someone's trespassing or something bad is happening. I grab my blinds and throw them up, and I see a pair of glowing eyes about 8 to 10 feet off the ground looking right at me. At first, I thought it was a bear standing on its hind legs, but the moonlight definitely showed otherwise. It looked, as I said, 8 to 10 feet tall, with reddish-brown hair, and it had a pretty muscular build. I was scared shitless, but it turned around and ran into the woods on its hind legs, and eventually got on all 4 legs before disappearing. It was pretty hard to sleep after that, but the next morning when the sun came up, I went out with my shotgun and saw footprints where it was standing that were about 18 inches tall." End quote. This has popped up many a time before when Reuben and I discussed Sasquatch, and it's one of the most terrifying things, in my opinion, in the cryptid world. To see a Sasquatch is one thing, but to see a Sasquatch drop on all 4s and move like a spider crawl is entirely another. While this encounter doesn't mention the spider crawl, it is still unique in how it mentions it drops on all 4s nonetheless. These things are very mysterious, of course, and why it might choose to go down on all 4 legs when you think of running on 2 legs is primarily a bipedal being, might be a bit faster. It's just one of those things that we just don't know and don't have answers to, but maybe it's a way of trying to pretend that, oh, maybe he'll think I'm a bear or something like that. But we can't necessarily gauge that level of intelligence if it's trying to pretend to be something else. We just don't know without having one in front of us to study. But at its core, there is a lot of familiarity with this encounter and other scenarios where people will open up their blinds, they'll look out the window, and it's standing right there. People in cabins that are several feet off the ground, and these things are able to just be right there and just peek in through the window and look and see who's in there. I remember a situation where they heard banging on around their house, and this was a remote location, and the woman was in the bathroom, and sure enough, the bathroom window was, I believe it was a second story. Don't quote me on that. I'll paraphrase a little bit. It was high, this window, and she saw something that was looking through the window at her, and she freaked out, and they went out and they could see these big footprints there. There's other instances too when people are out in the cabin, and sure enough, these things are banging on the walls, just like our previous scenario we talked about, and then they peek through the window. They're very curious. It doesn't mention the color of the eyes. It just says that they're glowing. And we have to take this with a grain of salt. You cannot take my word for it, but it seems like when you're dealing with Sasquatch that have red glowing eyes, you are more or less engaged in a more negative encounter and scenario as opposed to ones that have different colored eyes. And that is a whole can of worms, and it depends on your area of belief. When I talk about this with Reuben, Reuben is very religious, and so he brings a very, very interesting religious perspective into this, where you're dealing with a Bigfoot that has red eyes, and maybe there is some level of possession involved, something that is more demonic, because their lines kind of cross over. I've highlighted this loosely in previous episodes, but after doing this show for this period of time, and I'm not boosting myself or trying to gloat, none of that. Everyone is entitled to what they believe. But doing all these episodes, I feel like we're at a point where there's a triangle with cryptids like Bigfoot on one edge, and the next edge is your paranormal, your demonic and spiritualism, everything paranormal and spiritualistic and demonic and heaven and God religion. And then on the last edge, then you have UFO, extraterrestrial, out of this world kind of thing, maybe multidimensional, that you want to include that in there. And it's just funny how you go from one to the other, to the other, to the other, and it just kind of keeps going. There's this weird kind of connectedness. And of course, you can single them out and they can be their own thing. They absolutely fit into that category. But the more you look into this, it's weird. And I'm not trying to sway anyone's beliefs, and I apologize if I'm kind of rambling. But it's funny how there are certain similarities, and some of these things kind of connect. And I take comfort in that in a weird way, that, you know, it's not just one thing way off to the left here and one thing way up here to the right. It's kind of comforting to know that, hey, maybe at the end of the day, all these things are connected, and all these things are one thing that we're dealing with. And yeah, I don't know if that makes sense. It's where my mind has gone with this after looking into all these different things. And when I look into some of these encounters with Bigfoot, and you talk about the red eyes, and you talk about how they smell like sulfur, and it's funny because that can be affiliated with ghosts and demonic activity and so forth and so forth. It's those little things. I'm going to stop there though, because I feel like I'm going to be losing you. Lots of people I understand and respect. Bigfoot is Bigfoot. That's it. It's not anything else. And if that's what you choose to believe, then you have every right to believe that. So moving on, and I quote, thank you for bearing with me. December 21st, 2024. At approximately 3:30 p.m., my girlfriend and I were on our way back from a ski resort, and we had just passed the entrance to a nearby fish hatchery. As I was looking out the window at the river and wooded area that runs alongside the road, on our right side heading south, I noticed a figure standing next to a tree. Now, they were in the marsh or the water, I couldn't exactly tell, but this figure was what I estimated to be about 7.5 feet tall. It was about 75 meters from the road, and I could clearly see ahead, 2 shoulders and arms hanging down to below the waist. Below that, I believe it was in the water or in the marsh. Now, the figure was entirely black with no variation in color, and it didn't appear that it was clothing. I also believe it was facing away from me, looking towards the opposite direction. It was not moving, and it was standing entirely straight up from what I could see. At this point, I said to my girlfriend that I either saw a very tall person standing out in the water or woods, or that it was Bigfoot. I convinced her to turn around and try to locate exactly where I saw it, so we could pull the car over and look. After going back, we stopped for a few minutes, but I couldn't figure out the exact location where I saw it, and it wasn't safe to be stopped on the side of the road with a small shoulder. There was one small house about a minute down from where I saw it that appeared to be abandoned. There were no cars parked or people walking in that area from what we could see. There was also about a foot of snow at least, and it was about 20 degrees out. On our way back, I then Googled the nearby national forest and just added in Bigfoot. And for the very first thing that popped up was a sighting in almost the same area with the exact same description as I had seen. In my opinion, I believe I saw a Bigfoot that was ironically standing in the water right next to the fish hatchery looking for its dinner. Now, I can't think of a reason that someone would be standing in the water if it was a person, and I did not see a fishing pole. I couldn't make out any features, only the height, stature, long arms, and the solid black color on its whole body." End quote. A lot of lakes get restocked with fish, and you tend to see an increase in Bigfoot reports around these lakes. So is it out of the question to say these creatures know when the fish are in abundance? Is it out of the question for them to be consciously aware of the potential food source that hatcheries could provide? That's food for thought, literally. But that's a topic that we've had before, where me and Reuben are discussing it, and we've looked into an encounter where people go out hunting and fishing, and they know, okay, well, then there's not a lot of people out. We're hitting the season early, but we know that the lake was recently restocked. And sure enough, they hear calls, they see things that are a bit questionable, and I think that there is credibility where these things know. I think that they know when it's off season in national parks too. And I think when you're dealing with something that is traversing very long distances, and you're dealing with national parks all across the world, there are some national parks that are closed throughout some of the very, very weather-heavy times of the year. People are not going in there. And I think these creatures know that there's a lack there of people in these places. And so maybe that's where they hold up. Maybe that's where they bunker down for a few months before trekking on. It makes sense to me. And if it makes sense to me, I feel like that's good enough to make sense to a Bigfoot. But who really, really knows? At the end of the day, I think that these things exhibit enough intelligence to warrant the idea of when to move and when not to. I mean, look at how difficult it is to actually track one down and to actually prove its existence. That, to me, shows some very, very well-established form of intelligence of evasion. And they know how to evade a predator, clearly, because humans are certainly just that. But with all of that being said, our episode is concluded. Thank you for tuning in to Cryptid Clues this week. We'll be back next week. I am not sure what our topic will be. I'm going to have to do some digging and some research. Like I said, I spent a little bit of time on Vancouver Island a couple weeks back, and I did pick up a few other interesting notes on some paranormal things, so I might do something on that. I'll have to see if I can get Reuben back in for another episode as well. But until then, you can find more episodes on our feeds and reach us directly via CryptidClues@gmail.com. I am your host, Taylor. Thank you for tuning in, and remember, everyone, take care and stay safe.